The storm had not reached Dry Creek yet, but people could already feel it moving somewhere beyond the western hills. The air carried that strange stillness that always came before hard weather in the frontier. Horses shifted nervously beside hitching posts. Dogs barked at nothing. Even the wind sounded restless as it slid through the narrow streets between old wooden buildings faded by dust and years. Most mornings in Dry Creek followed the same rhythm. Men opened stores before sunrise. Women swept porches while coffee boiled inside kitchens. Ranch hands rode through town half awake with mud still on their boots. Folks complained about weather, prices, fences, or taxes because complaining made people feel like life still belonged to them. But this morning felt different. People gathered quietly near the Boone house before anyone understood why. Some came because they heard shouting. Others came because small towns survive on curiosity almost as much as water. And a few came because deep down, they already knew something ugly was about to happen. Clara Whitmore stood near the porch steps holding an old wooden box against her chest. The box looked worn smooth from years of use. One corner had been repaired with dark leather strips. Strange symbols were carved into the lid, faded enough most people ignored them unless they looked carefully. Elias Reed looked carefully. He stood across the street beneath the awning of Parker's feed store, one hand resting loosely near his coat pocket while he watched the scene unfold. Martha Boone stood on the porch above Clara with anger sharp enough to cut through the entire street. "You heard me," Martha snapped loudly. "A mouth that brings trouble does not eat at my table." Several townspeople shifted awkwardly. Not because Martha frightened them. Because humiliation always became uncomfortable once it lasted too long. Clara did not answer immediately. At 58 years old, she had learned silence often unsettled angry people more than shouting ever could. The wind pushed silver strands of hair across her face while she bent carefully to pick up a folded blanket lying near the steps. "Leave it," Martha hissed. "Everything in that house belongs to us now." The words landed hard enough that even nearby conversations stopped. A ranch hand near the saloon lowered his eyes. Mrs. Bennett near the tailor shop pretended to rearrange packages in her arms rather than watch directly. Two children paused beside the water trough openly staring at Clara with the fearless curiosity only children still carried. Clara slowly straightened again with the wooden box held tightly against her chest. For the first time that morning, she looked directly at Martha Boone. Not angry. Not wounded. Just tired. One day, Clara said quietly, "You will learn that owning a house and deserving it are not always the same thing." The street fell silent. Martha stepped down one stair. "You should be grateful we let you stay this long." A faint smile touched Clara's mouth then disappeared almost immediately. "Grateful." She repeated the word softly, like testing whether it still meant anything. Silas Boone leaned against the porch railing nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Unlike Martha, his anger looked uncertain. Forced. The kind men wore when fear sat underneath it. "That old box is not worth ruining your life over," he muttered. Clara glanced toward him briefly. "No," she answered calmly. "But what is inside might be." Elias noticed the reaction immediately. Silas Boone stiffened. "Only slightly. But enough." The old scout narrowed his eyes from across the street. There it was. Fear. Not hatred. Not greed alone. Fear. Elias had spent enough years around soldiers, traders, scouts, and tribal leaders to recognize the difference. Fear made people loud. Fear made decent people cruel. And fear made weak men dangerous. Martha folded her arms sharply. "You think people still care about your stories?" Clara adjusted her grip on the wooden box. "I think people care when storms finally reach their doorstep." "You sound crazy." "No," Clara replied softly. "Just older than you." A few people nearby exchanged uncertain looks. The conversation had shifted somewhere none of them fully understood. Elias noticed the symbols on the box again as sunlight briefly touched the carved wood. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. He knew that marking. Years ago, far east of Black Mesa, Elias had seen the same symbol burned carefully into cedar poles outside an Apache ceremonial camp. Not decoration. Not family markings. Protection. Promise. The memory unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Across the street, Martha Boone stepped closer until only inches separated her from Clara. You lost your husband. That is sad. Martha's voice lowered now, colder and more personal. But grief does not make you important. Clara's eyes remained steady. No, she answered. Keeping promises does. Something flickered across Silas Boone's face at those words. Elias caught it immediately. That fear again. The wind rose harder through town then, sending dust spinning across the street between boots and wagon wheels. One of the horses tied near the saloon jerked nervously against its reins. Far beyond Dry Creek, thunder rolled faintly through the hills. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Clara stepped away from the porch. Not defeated. Simply finished. She carried the wooden box carefully beneath one arm while walking toward the western edge of town. No one offered help. But no one mocked her either. That mattered. People in Dry Creek had grown used to silence protecting them from difficult choices. Elias watched Clara disappear slowly through blowing dust while townsfolk began speaking again in low uncertain voices. She finally lost that house. What was in the box? You think Boone knows something? Nobody knows anything. That woman always talked strange. No, Mrs. Bennet murmured quietly nearby. She just talks like someone carrying too much. Elias kept watching the road long after Clara disappeared from sight. Then finally he pushed himself away from the post outside the feed store. Old instinct stirred unpleasantly inside him. The kind he spent years trying to bury. Parker, the store owner, glanced toward him. You planning to chase trouble again, Elias? Elias pulled his hat lower against the wind. Trouble usually reaches me first. You are too old for heroics. I was too old 20 years ago. That earned the faintest laugh. But Elias did not smile back. Because something about the wooden box bothered him deeply now. And because Clara Whitmore had not looked like a woman losing her home. She looked like someone watching a clock finally run out. By late afternoon, the storm reached the outer valley. Dark clouds rolled low across the western sky while cold rain began cutting through the dust roads leading beyond Dry Creek. Most people hurried indoors before sunset. Lamps glowed behind windows. Stable doors slammed shut against rising wind. Elias saddled his horse anyway. The stable boy frowned while helping tighten the straps. You riding out in this? Elias adjusted his gloves slowly. Afraid so. Looking for Clara Whitmore? Elias paused briefly. Why would you ask that? The boy shrugged. You watched her longer than everyone else did. Elias mounted the horse without answering. Rain struck harder by the time he reached Miller Creek. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the hills, illuminating old fence posts and broken wagon tracks for brief seconds before darkness swallowed them again. The abandoned horse barn near the creek appeared ahead through sheets of rain. A faint orange glow flickered inside. Elias climbed down carefully and stepped toward the entrance. Clara sat beside a small fire near the rear wall with the wooden box resting beside her. Rain drummed steadily against the roof overhead while wine slipped through cracks in the old boards. She did not look surprised to see him. You always ride toward trouble, she asked quietly. Elias removed his hat slowly. Only when it starts calling my name. That habit will kill you. Probably. He settled onto an overturned crate near the fire and pulled a small tin coffee pot from his saddlebag. Clara watched him without speaking while he poured water carefully inside. Outside, thunder rolled again. For several minutes the only sounds were rain, wind, and crackling firewood. Then Elias finally looked toward the wooden box. "I know that symbol." Clara's hand tightened slightly against the lid. "Do you?" "I saw it near Apache territory years ago." She stared into the fire. "Then you know enough not to ask foolish questions." Elias gave a tired half-smile. "That depends how dangerous the answers are." Clara looked toward him carefully now. "Dangerous answers are the only kind people bury this long." The coffee finished heating. Elias handed her a cup. Their fingers brushed briefly. Cold hands. Tired hands. The hands of people who survived too many difficult winters. Clara took a slow drink before speaking again. Dry Creek was never supposed to last this long. Elias frowned slightly. "That sounds ominous." "It sounds true." Lightning flashed outside the barn again. For a moment Clara's face looked older in the white light. More exhausted than before. Elias leaned forward slowly. "What is really inside that box?" Clara remained quiet long enough that he thought she might refuse to answer. Finally she spoke. "A promise." "That all?" "A promise men forgot because peace lasted longer than expected." Elias looked toward the storm outside. The words settled badly inside his chest. He remembered the early years around Dry Creek. Raids. Army patrols. Burned wagons. Broken treaties. Too many frightened men with rifles making decisions nobody survived cleanly. Yet somehow Dry Creek remained untouched while nearby settlements disappeared. At the time, people called it luck. Elias stopped believing in luck years ago. "You kept this hidden how long?" he asked. 18 years. "Why?" Clara's eyes lowered toward the box. "Because one dying man believed hatred should not outlive him." The answer carried enough pain that Elias did not push further. Rain hammered harder against the barn roof now. Then suddenly, hoofbeats. Faint at first. Then clearer. More than one rider. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "There it is," she whispered. Elias stood immediately and moved toward the doorway. Dark shapes moved through rain somewhere beyond the creek. Not close yet. But approaching. He looked back toward Clara. "Who are they?" Her expression remained calm. Too calm. They finally learned Dry Creek broke the agreement. The hoofbeats continued for another minute. Then slowly faded into the storm again. Elias frowned. "They left." "No," Clara said softly. "They waited." The fire crackled low between them. Neither slept much that night. Before dawn, the storm weakened. Enough for pale gray light to creep slowly across the valley outside Miller Creek. Elias stepped from the barn first. And stopped immediately. Riders stood across the distant ridge overlooking Dry Creek. Apache riders. Dozens of them. Still. Silent. Watching. The morning wind moved gently through feathers and horse reins while sunlight slowly spread across the valley floor below. No rifles raised. No war cries. No movement at all. Just presence. Clara stepped beside Elias carrying the wooden box carefully against her chest. "They came peacefully," Elias murmured. "For now." Below the ridge, Dry Creek slowly woke beneath the cold morning light. People stepped onto porches one by one. Conversation stopped. Children pointed toward the hills. A rancher removed his hat nervously. Martha Boone appeared outside the house looking suddenly much less certain than the day before. Silas Boone stared openly toward the riders with visible panic creeping beneath his forced composure. Chief Nantan rode slowly down from the ridge alone. Older now. broad shoulders wrapped beneath a dark weathered blanket. His face carried no anger. Only disappointment. That somehow felt worse. He stopped several feet from Clara and lowered his head respectfully. "You kept the promise longer than they deserved," he said quietly. Clara looked exhausted. "I tried." Nantan's eyes shifted toward Dry Creek. The railroad men arrived sooner than expected. At the mention of the railroad, several townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks. Elias noticed immediately. Some of them already knew. Silas Boone stepped forward suddenly. "She has no authority here anymore." Chief Nantan looked at him calmly. Then toward the new survey stakes visible near the western fields outside town. When he finally spoke, his voice remained low and steady. "A foolish man burns his roof to chase away winter," he said. "Then acts surprised when the cold enters his home." Nobody answered. Because everyone understood he was no longer talking about weather. Clara slowly turned toward the town. Wind moved through her silver hair while she held the wooden box tightly against her chest. "They thought they pushed out a widow," she said. Quietly. The people of Dry Creek listened now. Really listened. But what they truly pushed away, Clara looked toward the survey stakes near the valley road. Was the last thing protecting this town from what is coming. The morning after the storm did not bring peace to Dry Creek. It brought questions. They hung over the town heavier than the clouds still dragging across the eastern sky. Mud clung to wagon wheels. Rainwater dripped from porch roofs. Horses stamped in shallow puddles along the main street. No one spoke loudly at first, as if the Apache riders on the ridge could hear every careless word spoken below. Clara Whitmore stood near the center of town with the wooden box held firmly against her chest. Beside her, Elias Reed watched the faces around them. That was something he had learned to do long ago. Not listen first. Watch first. Men often lied with their mouths before they understood what their hands had already confessed. Martha Boone stood on the porch of the house that had belonged to Clara's late husband. Her face remained hard, but her eyes had lost some of the certainty from the day before. Silas Boone stood a step behind her, hat pulled low, jaw set too tight. He looked like a man trying to decide whether anger or fear would serve him better. Chief Nantan remained on his horse near the edge of town. Behind him, Apache riders waited in disciplined silence. Their stillness unsettled Dry Creek more than threats would have. A young boy near the livery whispered to his father, "Are they here to fight?" His father did not answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, "No. They came to be heard." That answer traveled farther than he intended. A few townspeople looked toward him. Some approvingly. Some with discomfort. One old rancher spat into the mud and muttered that being heard was usually the first step before being owed something. Dry Creek was already dividing. Not into heroes and villains. Into frightened people, greedy people, tired people, and people who had finally grown old enough to wonder whether the old stories had been wrong. Clara noticed all of it. She had spent 18 years inside this town learning who looked away first, who listened only after loss, and who hid cruelty beneath practical words. Chief Nantan looked toward the box. "The promise must be opened in front of witnesses," he said. Martha's voice cut through the damp air. "She has no right to speak for this town." A few people glanced toward Clara. A few toward Nantan. Elias stepped forward before Clara could answer. "She may not speak for the town," he said, "but she seems to be the only one here who remembers what the town owes." Martha turned toward him sharply. "You have been gone too long to lecture us." Elias nodded once. "That is true." The simple admission took some edge from her anger. Then he added, "But I was here long enough to know Dry Creek was never just lucky." Silas Boone looked at him quickly. Too quickly. Clara saw it. So did Elias. Chief Nantan slowly dismounted. His boots touched the wet ground without hurry. He did not approach Martha. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood beside Clara and waited. That patience forced the town to choose its next movement. Mrs. Bennet stepped down from the tailor shop porch first. Her husband had died years earlier in a winter cattle accident, and since then she had become the kind of woman people trusted because she rarely spoke unless words had weight. "If there is a promise," she said quietly, "we should hear it." Walter Pike, owner of the general store, frowned. "And if hearing it costs us railroad money?" Nobody answered. But many heard the question exactly as he meant it. The railroad had been hovering around Dry Creek for months. Survey stakes had appeared first like harmless sticks in the earth. Then came men in clean coats with maps, ledgers, and offers that sounded generous only if a person did not ask what they were buying. Dry Creek was poor enough to be tempted. That made the truth dangerous. Clara turned toward the courthouse. "Then we open it there." Silas Boone scoffed. "This is foolishness." Elias looked at him. "Then it should be easy to prove." Silas opened his mouth, but no words came. The walk to the courthouse felt longer than it was. Townspeople followed in small clusters. No one wanted to appear too interested. No one wanted to be left outside either. Children were pulled close by mothers. Ranch hands stood near the back. Shopkeepers whispered about deeds and land values. A few older men stayed silent because they remembered years Clara had not yet explained. Inside, the courthouse smelled of damp coats, old wood, and cold ashes from the stove. Clara placed the wooden box on the front table. For the first time since anyone in Dry Creek had seen it, she removed both hands from the lid. The strange carved symbol showed clearly now. A circle split by 3 lines. Elias stared at it. The old memory returned more sharply this time. A cedar post outside an Apache camp. A dying fire. A young warrior telling him, "This mark means a thing given under protection. Break it, and every witness becomes responsible." Clara noticed his expression. "You do remember." Elias swallowed slowly. "I remember enough to be ashamed." She looked at him for a second, then turned back to the box. A small iron key hung from a cord around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. When she pulled it free, several people murmured. Martha's eyes fixed on the key. Silas Boone whispered, "Clara." It was the first time he had spoken her name without contempt since the previous day. Clara looked at him. There was no victory in her face. Only sadness. "You knew there was something in here," she said. Silas shifted uncomfortably. "I knew George kept papers." George kept his word. That quiet sentence silenced him. George Whitmore had been Clara's husband. A plain man by most accounts. Good with horses. Bad at cards. Slow to anger. Dead 6 years now from fever after a wet spring. Most people had forgotten that before George became a tired rancher, he had helped bring wounded families into Dry Creek during the border troubles. Clara had not forgotten. She unlocked the box. The lid opened with a dry wooden creak. No one breathed loudly. Inside were not jewels, not money, not a weapon. Only papers. A folded map wrapped in oilcloth. A faded blue ribbon tied around a stack of letters. A small brass military badge. 3 names written on a strip of leather. And a bundle of dry sage so old it nearly crumbled at the edges. Walter Pike muttered. "That is it." Chief Nantan looked at him. "That is more than most towns keep when they promise peace." Clara lifted the map first and spread it carefully across the table. It showed Dry Creek as it had been 18 years earlier. Smaller. Rougher. Barely more than a crossing point near water. Several markings had been drawn west of town near Black Mesa. Not survey lines. Boundary markers. Elias leaned closer. He recognized the creek bends. He recognized the ridge path. And he recognized the land the railroad now wanted. Clara placed one finger on the marked area. This land was never to be sold. A wave of murmurs moved through the room. Walter Pike stepped forward. That land belongs to Boone Holdings. Clara looked at him calmly. On paper, yes. Martha seized the opening. Then there is nothing to discuss. Elias turned toward her. Paper has always been convenient when people want to forget who bled before ink dried. The room quieted. Clara untied the blue ribbon and unfolded the first letter. She did not read all of it. Only pieces. Enough. On the 17th day after the winter raid, the people of Dry Creek were granted safe passage, water access, and protection from retaliation by agreement with Nantan of the Eastern Ridge Band. A few heads turned toward Chief Nantan. His expression did not change. Clara continued. In exchange, the town agrees no road, rail line, mining passage, or armed route shall cross the burial ground in Spring Valley west of Black Mesa. She lowered the paper. Silence filled the courthouse. This was no longer superstition. No longer Clara's grief. It was written. Dated. Signed. Elias looked toward the names at the bottom. George Whitmore. Captain Aaron Bell. Elias Reed. His own name struck him like a hand across the face. For several seconds he could not move. Clara saw the recognition. So did Nantan. So did Silas Boone. Martha looked from the paper to Elias. You signed this? Elias's voice came out quieter than he expected. Yes. The room shifted around him. People who once saw him as a harmless old drifter suddenly looked again. Some with surprise. Some with suspicion. Elias stepped closer to the table. I was a guide. Then, he said. For Army scouts, settlers, sometimes anyone who paid enough. Dry Creek was nearly finished that winter. People were trapped here. Supplies were low. Men were scared enough to do stupid things. He looked toward Nantan. His people could have let this town starve. Nantan's voice remained calm. We chose not to. Clara picked up the brass badge next. Captain Bell wrote the agreement before he died. He believed someone needed to leave proof. What happened to him? Mrs. Bennet asked softly. Clara looked down at the badge. He was shot by men who did not want peace to survive. The room went cold. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Not from surprise. From memory. A muddy ravine. Gun smoke. Bell pressing the box into George Whitmore's hands while rain washed blood from his sleeve. Clara younger then, standing in a doorway as men argued outside about whether Apache protection made Dry Creek look weak. Elias had left 2 days later. He told himself it was because the army reassigned him. That had been the clean version. The truth was less flattering. He left because peace required more courage than war. Clara returned the badge to the box. My husband kept this after Bell died. When George passed, it came to me. Walter Pike frowned. Why hide it? Clara looked around the room. Because most of you did not want truth. You wanted quiet. That struck several people harder than accusation. A woman near the back whispered, we did not know. Clara nodded gently. No. Some did not. Her eyes moved to Silas Boone. But some did. Silas's face paled. Martha stepped in front of him protectively. You have no proof of that. Chief Nantan spoke before Clara did. Your husband's brother came with railroad men 2 months ago. Martha stiffened. Silas looked down. The room turned toward him. Elias watched the man carefully. Silas Boone was not evil in the grand way stories like to make men evil. He was smaller than that. More common. A man with debts. A man with land he did not fully own in spirit but could sell on paper. A man who convinced himself old promises mattered less than new money. Silas finally spoke. The railroad will save this town. Walter Pike nodded. He is not wrong. Several others murmured uncertain agreement. Dry Creek had struggled for years. Bad harvests. Dying cattle. Young people leaving. A railroad spur could bring markets, supplies, jobs, money. That was what made the conflict real. Not everyone supporting the railroad was cruel. Some were simply desperate. Clara understood that better than anyone. She looked tired when she answered. A town does not save itself by selling the thing that kept it alive. Pike crossed his arms. And what do you expect us to do? Stay poor because of a promise made before half of us lived here? Elias turned toward him. That is usually how promises work. A few people gave short uncomfortable laughs. The tension eased for one breath. Then Clara lifted the strip of leather from the box. 3 names were written on it. She read them aloud. Nantan. George Whitmore. Elias Reed. Elias looked down. Clara held the leather gently. These were the witnesses who swore the agreement would be protected if Captain Bell's papers were challenged. Pike pointed toward Elias. Then ask him. Does he still stand by it? Everyone looked toward Elias. For years, Elias Reed had survived by remaining useful and uncommitted. He had guided men through dangerous country. Delivered messages. Translated when needed. Disappeared when responsibility grew heavy. But age had a way of removing the pleasure from running. He looked at Clara. Her face did not ask him to save her. Only to stop hiding. Elias slowly nodded. Yes, he said. I stand by it. The word seemed to cost him something. Clara's eyes softened, but only slightly. Martha shook her head. This is madness. You expect a whole town to bow to old paper and Apache memory? Chief Nantan finally stepped closer to the table. No, he said. We expect the town to remember its own word. That silence held longer. Outside, wind pushed against the courthouse windows. In the distance, a hammer struck wood near the rail survey camp west of town. One strike. Then another. Everyone heard it. The future was not waiting politely for Dry Creek to decide. A rancher named Tom Hale rose slowly from the back bench. Railroad men are camped near the South Wash, he said. Silas Boone shot him a warning look. Tom ignored it. They said they start full survey tomorrow. Pike muttered, that is their right if land is sold. Tom shook his head. One of their men went missing near Black Mesa last week. The room changed instantly. Not loudly. But sharply. Mrs. Bennett pressed a hand to her throat. A young ranch hand near the door whispered a curse. Martha looked toward Chief Nantan. Nantan's expression darkened with quiet disappointment. We did not take him. Tom swallowed. I am not saying you did. But the fear had already entered the room. That was how it always began. A missing man. An old promise. A town already divided. Clara closed the box slowly. The sound of the lid settling back into place carried through the courthouse like a final warning. Elias looked from Clara to the townspeople. Dry Creek no longer had the luxury of pretending this was about one widow and one house. The railroad wanted land. The Apache wanted the promise honored. The town wanted survival. And every choice now carried a cost. Clara lifted the wooden box back into her arms. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but every person in the room heard the weight beneath it. By tomorrow, this will no longer be a secret. No one answered. Outside, Beyond the muddy street and the wet buildings of Dry Creek, the survey stakes stood in the western fields like thin bones waiting for a grave. By evening, Dry Creek no longer sounded like the same town. The streets were still muddy from the storm. Lanterns still glowed behind dusty windows. Horses still stamped outside the saloon while tired ranch hands drank whiskey they could barely afford. But beneath the ordinary sounds, tension moved through the town like a second storm building under the first. People had started choosing sides. Not openly. Not yet. But Elias Reed could feel it in the pauses between conversations and the way voices lowered whenever someone mentioned the railroad, the Apache riders, or Clara Whitmore. He stood outside the general store near sunset, watching men unload feed from a wagon while Walter Pike argued with two ranchers near the hitching posts. "We need the railroad," Pike insisted. "You think Dry Creek survives another 5 years without outside trade?" One rancher scratched at his beard uneasily. "Maybe." Pike snorted. "Maybe does not buy winter grain." The second rancher, Tom Hale, glanced toward the western ridge where the Apache campfires would soon become visible after dark. "And maybe digging tracks through sacred ground buys us more problems than grain solves." Pike threw up his hands. "Sacred to who?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence said enough. Elias noticed several townspeople nearby pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Dry Creek was splitting exactly the way most frontier towns split. Not between good and evil. Between fear and necessity. Between memory and survival. And somewhere in the middle stood Clara Whitmore holding 18 years of truth no one wanted responsibility for. The courthouse meeting earlier that morning had spread through town faster than wildfire through dry brush. By afternoon, people who had ignored Clara for years suddenly remembered conversations, missing details, old rumors from winters long gone. Mrs. Bennett claimed her late husband once mentioned Apache riders guiding settlers safely through canyon passes during a blizzard. The barber remembered Captain Bell arguing publicly with railroad surveyors years before his death. Even the stable boy swore he overheard Silas Boone discussing land prices with railroad agents weeks earlier. Truth was beginning to move. And once truth started moving through a town, it became impossible to predict where it would stop. Across the street, Martha Boone stepped from the hotel with tight shoulders and a face sharpened by humiliation. People noticed. That was what truly angered her. Not Clara. Not the box. The attention. For years Martha Boone had controlled conversations in Dry Creek simply by speaking louder than everyone else. Now people lowered their voices when she approached. That frightened her more than Apache riders ever could. She spotted Elias immediately. "You enjoying this?" she asked sharply. Elias kept his eyes on the street. "No, looks like you are." He finally turned toward her. "Martha, half this town spent years pretending Clara was just an old widow talking nonsense." His voice stayed calm. "Turns out she was the only person keeping track of promises." Martha folded her arms tightly. "Promises made before most of us even lived here. That does not erase them." "It should." Several people nearby fell quiet. Martha noticed. Again, the attention unsettled her. "You think the Apache care about peace?" she snapped. "They care about control." Elias studied her carefully. "No," he answered. "I think they care about whether people keep their word." Martha scoffed. "You sound just like Clara." Elias almost smiled. "That should concern me more than it does." Martha stepped closer. "You know what really scares people?" Her voice lowered. "Not the riders. Not the old agreements. What scares them is the idea that this town stayed alive because of people they spent years calling enemies. There it was. The real wound. Not fear of war. Pride. Dry Creek had built part of its identity around old frontier stories. Settlers surviving hardship alone. Strong families protecting civilization from danger beyond the valley. If Clara's papers were true, then survival had depended on cooperation nobody wanted remembered anymore. That truth threatened people differently than violence did. Elias watched Martha walk away toward the Boone property while twilight settled slowly over town. She was not entirely wrong. People were afraid. Because once one lie collapsed, others often followed behind it. Near the edge of town, Clara sat alone outside the old boarding stable where she had stayed since leaving the Boone house. The wooden box rested beside her chair while she repaired a torn saddle strap beneath fading light. Elias approached slowly. "You know everyone is arguing about you right now." Clara did not look up. People always argue louder when truth becomes inconvenient. Elias leaned against the stable doorway. "You could have opened that box years ago." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Clara pulled the leather tighter through the buckle before answering. "Because peace held." The simple honesty of the answer silenced him briefly. A lantern glowed softly beside the stable entrance while distant. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond Black Mesa again. Clara finally looked toward him. "You still think this ends quietly?" Elias stared out across Dry Creek. "No, neither do I." For a moment they simply listened to the sounds of town life continuing uneasily around them. Then Elias spoke again. "I saw survey crews near the South Wash earlier." Clara's expression hardened slightly. "How many?" "6 men. Maybe more camped farther west." She nodded once. "They are moving too fast." Elias frowned. "You think Boone invited them already?" "I think Boone sees railroad money as rescue." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. Men in debt usually confuse desperation with opportunity. The wind shifted colder through the street. A church bell rang faintly in the distance. Then hoofbeats echoed suddenly from the eastern road. Fast. Several townspeople turned immediately. 3 riders entered Dry Creek carrying railroad company colors on their coats. Not wealthy executives. Field men. Surveyors. Their horses were mud-covered from hard travel, and none of them looked pleased to see Apache fires visible beyond the western ridge. The lead rider climbed down stiffly outside the saloon. "Who runs this town?" he demanded. Nobody answered right away. Not because nobody knew. Because suddenly nobody wanted responsibility. Finally Walter Pike pointed toward Silas Boone approaching from across the street. The surveyor looked relieved. "Good. We got missing men and burned markers near Black Mesa." The entire street quieted immediately. Tom Hale looked toward the rider. "Burned?" The surveyor nodded sharply. "Whole line torched last night." Murmurs spread quickly. Not panic. Something worse. Suspicion. The surveyor lowered his voice slightly. "We also lost 1 man near the Ridge Trail 3 days ago." Several townspeople glanced instinctively toward the Apache campfires beyond town. Chief Nantan had warned them the land should remain untouched. Now a man was missing. The old frontier fear returned faster than logic. Elias felt it happen almost physically. Not hatred. Momentum. Dangerous momentum. Silas Boone stepped forward quickly. "You accusing someone?" The surveyor shrugged. "I am saying. My company expects protection if we are paying for land access." There it was again. Money. Dry Creek needed it badly enough that some people already looked tempted to ignore everything Clara revealed earlier. Walter Pike crossed his arms. "The railroad brings jobs." Tom Hale answered immediately. "And maybe graves." Several nearby ranchers muttered agreement. Others stayed uncertain. The division deepened. From the stable doorway, Clara watched the entire exchange silently. Elias noticed something then. She did not look surprised. Only tired. As though she had spent years waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The surveyor finally noticed her standing beneath the stable lantern. "You Clara Whitmore?" She nodded once. The man pointed toward the wooden box beside her chair. "That the thing causing all this trouble?" Clara's eyes stayed steady. "No," she answered calmly. "Greed caused the trouble. The box only proved it." A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. The surveyor laughed dryly. "Lady, tracks are coming through this valley whether people pray over dirt or not." Before Clara could answer, another voice interrupted quietly. "You should leave." Everyone turned. Chief Nantan stood near the edge of town beside two Apache riders. No one had heard them approach. The surveyor stiffened immediately. "You threatening me?" Nantan's expression remained unreadable. "I am warning you." The surveyor scoffed. "This land belongs to Dry Creek now." Nantan looked toward the western hills. "No land belongs to people foolish enough to destroy it." The tension sharpened instantly. Silas Boone stepped between them. "We are handling this peacefully." Nantan's eyes moved toward him slowly. "Then stop inviting men who mistake peace for weakness." No one spoke after that. Because even those supporting the railroad understood something important. The Apache riders were not acting like raiders preparing war. They were acting like people watching others repeat an old mistake. That frightened Dry Creek far more. The surveyors eventually disappeared into the saloon while townspeople drifted into nervous conversations beneath darkening skies. Elias remained beside Clara. Outside the stable. "You were right," he muttered. "About what?" "This town never wanted the truth." He looked toward the saloon windows glowing through dusk. "It wanted comfort." Clara tied off the repaired saddle strap carefully. "Most towns do." Elias lowered himself onto an old crate nearby. For several minutes neither spoke. Then finally he asked the question sitting heavy in his chest since morning. "Why me?" Clara glanced toward him. "What? You could have burned those papers years ago. Walked away. Let the whole thing die." Elias rubbed tired fingers across his jaw. "So why keep my name attached to any of it?" Clara studied him quietly before answering. "Because Captain Bell trusted you." Elias laughed softly without humor. "That was his mistake." "No," Clara replied gently. "Your mistake was believing leaving erased responsibility." The words landed harder than accusation. "Because they were true." Elias stared down at the muddy ground beneath his boots. Years ago, after Bell died, Elias convinced himself the agreement would survive without him. George Whitmore was solid. Clara was stubborn. Nantan kept his side faithfully. So Elias left. One less man carrying the burden. Or so he thought. Now the burden had returned anyway. Older. Heavier. And somehow more dangerous because money had entered the conversation. Inside the saloon, raised voices erupted suddenly. Someone shouted about missing surveyors. Another voice cursed Apache threats. A chair scraped loudly across wooden floors. Tom Hale exited first, shaking his head. "This town is losing its damn mind." Elias stood immediately. "What happened?" "Railroad boys started talking brave after whiskey." Hale spat into the mud. "Now half the room thinks war starts tomorrow." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Fear spreads faster than truth." "Yes," Elias admitted quietly. "Especially in places already struggling." The stable doors creaked softly behind them as cold night wind swept through Dry Creek. One by one, lanterns began extinguishing across town. But nobody truly rested. Not Martha Boone pacing inside her house. Not Walter Pike calculating railroad profits. Not Tom Hale worrying about another frontier. Conflict. And certainly not Elias Reed. Near midnight, he stood alone beside the water trough outside town watching distant Apache campfires flicker against the dark hills. Then he noticed movement near the western survey line. A figure on horseback. Too far away to identify. The rider stopped near one of the survey stakes. For several seconds nothing happened. Then flames suddenly burst upward into the night. One survey marker. Burning. Elias straightened immediately. Another stake caught fire farther down the ridge. Then another. Not a wildfire. Deliberate. Controlled. A message. Within moments dogs began barking across Dry Creek. Lanterns reignited. People stepped onto porches shouting questions into darkness. The flames burned steadily against the black hills west of town like warning signals. Elias stared toward them silently. He did not know who lit the fires. Maybe Apache riders. Maybe frightened settlers. Maybe railroad men creating excuses. At that point, it hardly mattered. Because Dry Creek would wake tomorrow no longer arguing about old promises. Now the town would have to choose what kind of future it was willing to risk for them. Dry Creek woke before sunrise the next morning. Not because people were rested. Because nobody truly slept. The burned survey stakes still smoldered west of town, thin lines of smoke drifting upward into the cold gray dawn. The sight unsettled everyone differently. Some blamed Apache riders immediately. Some blamed railroad men trying to provoke fear. Some blamed desperate ranchers afraid of losing their land. Most people blamed uncertainty itself. That was the real problem with fear. Once it entered a town, it stopped needing facts to survive. Elias Reed stood outside the stable washing sleep from his face with cold water from a bucket when Clara stepped quietly onto the porch behind him. Neither spoke at first. The valley looked pale and exhausted beneath the early morning sky. Wind moved softly through wet grass beyond town while distant crows circled near the western ridge. Finally Clara asked, "How bad?" Elias wiped water from his beard. Bad enough people started choosing explanations before breakfast. Clara nodded. Once. That means they are frightened. You sound surprised they lasted this long. A faint tired smile touched her face. Dry Creek survived because people here spent years pretending difficult things belonged to somebody else. Elias leaned against the trough beside her. You think it ends today? No, Clara looked toward the smoke rising near Black Mesa. But I think pretending ends today. Before Elias could answer, church bells rang sharply through town. Not for prayer. For gathering. The sound carried across Dry Creek quickly. Doors opened. Boots struck muddy streets. Voices rose in uneasy conversation as people moved toward the courthouse once again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. Less curious. More serious. The railroad surveyors stood near the saloon with hard expressions and travel rifles resting openly beside them. Across town, Apache riders remained visible on the distant ridge above the valley. Still silent. Still waiting. Between both sides stood Dry Creek. And for the first time in years, the town understood neutrality might no longer exist. Inside the courthouse, every bench filled quickly. Walter Pike sat near the front looking irritated and tired. Tom Hale stood near the back wall beside several ranchers. Mrs. Bennett clutched her shawl tightly while whispering quiet prayers beneath her breath. Martha Boone entered with chin lifted high, though the strain beneath her confidence had become obvious now. Silas Boone followed beside her looking 10 years older than the week before. Clara remained near the center aisle holding the wooden box calmly in both hands. Elias stood beside the rear window watching the room settle into silence. Then Walter Pike stood first. We cannot stop progress because of old fear, he announced. Several people nodded immediately. Pike pressed forward while he still had momentum. The railroad brings supplies, work, trade routes. Maybe even enough money to stop this town from drying up completely. That land is not empty, Tom Hale answered. It is land, Pike snapped. Not a church. A murmur spread through the room. Chief Nantan stood quietly near the doorway listening without interruption. Mrs. Bennet finally spoke up. And what happens after the railroad comes? Pike looked frustrated. We survive. Maybe, she answered softly. Or maybe we just become another stop people forget once tracks move farther west. The room quieted again. Dry Creek had always feared becoming invisible more than poor. That was what the railroad truly offered. Importance. Elias watched Silas Boone carefully during the arguments. The man looked trapped now. Not malicious. Cornered. Years ago, Silas likely convinced himself selling land was practical. Then railroad money entered the valley faster than expected, and suddenly practical decisions grew teeth. Tom Hale stepped forward. You all saw those burned stakes. Pike immediately pointed toward Nantan. You think that was coincidence? Chief Nantan's expression did not change. No, the answer startled several people. Pike frowned. Then who burned them? Nantan looked around the room slowly. Men who understand warnings. That only deepened the tension. Martha Boone folded her arms. This town cannot live afraid forever. Clara finally spoke. No, she agreed quietly. But fear and caution are not the same thing. Martha turned sharply toward her. You expect everyone here to sacrifice survival for promises made by dead men. Clara held her gaze calmly. No. I expect people to understand why those promises existed. The courthouse fell silent again. Clara slowly placed the wooden box on the table before continuing. 18 years ago, Dry Creek stood between the railroad and Apache territory. Captain Bell believed peace mattered more than expansion. She looked around the room carefully. Some people agreed. Others saw profit waiting. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Silas Boone. Those arguments never disappeared. They only became quieter. The words settled heavily over the room. Because everyone understood she was no longer speaking only about the past. Outside, wind rattled softly against courthouse windows. Then Elias stepped forward unexpectedly. Clara looked toward him with slight surprise. For years, Elias Reed survived by staying one step outside responsibility. Even now, part of him wanted to remain quiet and let the town decide its own fate. But age had stripped something from him recently. Patience for cowardice. He removed his hat slowly. I should say something before this goes further. The room listened immediately. Elias rarely volunteered speeches. When Captain Bell died, he began quietly, I told myself leaving Dry Creek was the smart choice. He looked toward the floor briefly. I convinced myself peace would survive without me protecting it. Clara watched him carefully. So I left George Whitmore carrying the burden. I left Clara carrying the burden. And I told myself silence was safer than conflict. His voice lowered slightly. But silence does not stop damage. It only delays who suffers first. Nobody moved. Even Walter Pike remained quiet now. Elias looked toward the railroad surveyors near the back wall. You think this land is empty because nobody bothered teaching you otherwise. He pointed west. That valley kept this town alive through years most settlements around here vanished. One surveyor scoffed softly. Sounds like ghost stories. Elias nodded once. That is what truth becomes after enough frightened people survive because of it. The room held still. Clara noticed something changing then. Not agreement. Listening. Real listening. Mrs. Bennet slowly stood from her seat. My husband used to say peace feels invisible right until it disappears. No one mocked her. Tom Hale rubbed tired hands across his face. What happens if we stop the railroad? Pike answered immediately. We stay poor. And if we do not? Hale asked. No one answered right away. Finally Chief Nantan spoke. Then more men arrive. The words remained calm. Which made them frightening. One railroad becomes another, Nantan continued. Then fences. Soldiers. Miners. Hunters. His eyes moved across the room carefully. You call it progress. We call it the beginning of the end. The surveyor near the back laughed bitterly. You threatening war? Nantan looked almost saddened by the question. No, he answered softly. I am telling you what always happens when men confuse ownership with wisdom. That silence lasted long enough for everyone to feel it. Then suddenly Martha Boone stood. I am tired of this town acting guilty for surviving. Several heads turned toward her. Martha's voice trembled now, not with anger but exhaustion. My husband worked that land. My family survived droughts and winters and debt. She looked toward Clara. You ask people to protect promises while they struggle feeding themselves. Clara's expression softened slightly. For years I protected those promises alone because I understood exactly how desperate this town was. Martha blinked. Something in her anger cracked briefly. Clara stepped closer. You thought I stayed in George's house because I had nowhere else to go. She gently touched the wooden box. I stayed because someone had to remain here long enough to warn people before this happened. The room grew still again. For the first time since the arguments began, Martha looked less defensive than confused. As though she suddenly realized Clara had never been protecting herself. She had been protecting Dry Creek. Outside, thunder rolled faintly again beyond the western hills. Another storm approaching. The courthouse doors creaked open suddenly. A young ranch hand rushed inside breathless. Railroad crews are moving west already, he blurted. Half a mile from Black Mesa. The room erupted instantly. Not panic. Movement. Voices. Arguments. Pike insisted work should continue. Tom Hale cursed beneath his breath. Several ranchers demanded armed escorts. The surveyors argued nobody had authority to stop federal rail expansion. Through all of it, Clara remained still. Then she quietly closed the wooden box. The sound cut through the room surprisingly sharply. People fell silent again. Clara looked toward Elias. Then toward Nantan. Finally toward the town itself. You still have time, she said softly. No speech followed. No grand declaration. Just truth. Simple and tired. Dry Creek stood balanced between greed and memory, and every person inside that courthouse knew whichever choice came next would shape the valley long after all of them were buried. Walter Pike broke the silence first. We vote. Several people nodded immediately. That felt familiar. Manageable. A town could survive a vote easier than uncertainty. By late afternoon, nearly all of Dry Creek gathered outside the courthouse beneath thickening clouds. The decision came slowly. Hands raised. Arguments repeated. Old friendships strained quietly at the edges. In the end, the result shocked nearly everyone. The vote passed by only 3 voices. Dry Creek would suspend railroad access to the Western Valley until federal review of the old treaty claims. Not a permanent victory. Not a miracle. Just enough. The railroad surveyors reacted angrily. One promised legal action before riding east with his men near sunset. Others warned the town would regret rejecting progress. Maybe they were right. But for now, the tracks stopped short of Black Mesa. As evening settled over the valley, Apache riders began quietly preparing to leave the ridge. No celebration followed. Only relief. Tired relief. Chief Nantan approached Clara one final time near the edge of town. "You carried the burden well," he said. Clara shook her head faintly. "No. I carried it too long alone." Nantan glanced toward Elias standing nearby. "Not alone anymore." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Nantan mounted his horse and looked toward Dry Creek one last time. "Peace survives only while people keep choosing it," he said quietly. Then the riders disappeared westward beneath the darkening sky. That night, rain finally returned to the valley. Not violent. Steady. Soft against rooftops and muddy streets. Dry Creek looked smaller beneath the storm somehow. Less proud. More honest. Elias found Clara sitting beneath the stable porch watching rain fall beyond the lantern glow. The wooden box rested beside her chair once again. He carried 2 cups of coffee. "You always appear when weather turns bad," she asked quietly. Elias handed her 1 cup. "At my age, bad weather finds me faster." A faint smile touched Clara's face. For several minutes they sat listening to rain strike the earth outside. No speeches. No dramatic relief. Only 2 tired people finally sitting still after years spent carrying different versions of the same guilt. Elias stared toward the lights of Dry Creek in the distance. "You think this town changes after tonight?" Clara considered the question carefully. "Not completely. No." She shook her head. "People do not become better overnight." Her eyes moved toward the rain. "But sometimes they become honest enough to start." The storm softened gradually across the valley. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled one final time before fading into darkness. Clara rested one hand gently atop the wooden box. For 18 years it had carried promises, grief, memory, and fear. Tonight it carried something else too. An ending. Or maybe simply a beginning no one in Dry Creek expected to survive long enough to see. Elias leaned back in the chair beside her. The town below remained imperfect. Still poor. Still stubborn. Still frightened of the future. But for the first time in many years, Dry Creek no longer belonged entirely to silence. And out beyond the rain-dark valley, where the western hills disappeared into night, peace remained fragile but alive.